When Tristan and I got married, we planted a tree together. It was a little olive tree that we planted in a sweet little pot that we had chosen for the occasion. And we had a ritual during which our families watered the tree with good wishes for us and our marriage. It was very sweet and had lots of good metaphors about how we nurture and grow our relationships. However, it was perhaps a little short-sighted for the two of us who had not had much luck with houseplants up to that point to think that a plant was a good way to symbolize our marriage. As you might have guessed by now, that plant died within the first year we were married. And I have to say that in that Noah story, God was a lot smarter than we were when God chose that rainbow to symbolize God's promises. Unlike plants, rainbows come back around again and again, no matter what you do. You could blame that little olive tree's demise on all kinds of things, that we didn't have enough light in our tiny first floor New York City apartment, or that it was maybe a little too close to the window and there was too much of a draft, or that an olive tree was perhaps just a bit ambitious for living in the Northeast. But when it comes down to it, the reason it died is probably just that we didn't water it enough. All of those lovely metaphors about watering and nurturing our relationship, we just forgot, at least half the time. And plants really are like relationships. They need constant energy and attention, constant nurturing to grow and flourish. 5 years later, a friend who knew about our failure with that first tree gave us a new tree for our 5th anniversary. It was in a gorgeous pot that she had made herself. And she told us that it was a very hardy tree. She assured us that we wouldn't have to pay much attention to this one. It was a lovely, thoughtful gift, a second chance at sustaining those metaphors of nurturing and growth. Now, I can't tell you exactly how long that plant survived, other than that we've now been married for 8.5 years, and the plant hasn't been with us for quite some time. Again, we could blame this on all kinds of things. I think it was a cat who finally broke the pot, for example, but the tree was dead long before that. Now, even though I don't really believe that the fate of these trees is connected to the fate of our relationship, we're still married, by the way, I nonetheless feel a little guilty that we did so poorly at keeping them alive. What does that say about our persistence in our commitments, after all? The thing about trees is that you do need to give them attention, that there are certain things that they need to continue to survive and thrive. And much the same could be said for relationships. You need to keep feeding them and nurturing them, to offer time and energy, and to return and repair when things go wrong. It's not just our one-on-one relationships that need that constant attention and nurturing, but also our relationships with larger communities. In Unitarian Universalism, one of the ways we talk about that constant need to sustain relationships is by talking about covenant. Covenants can look all kinds of different ways, but basically they are a set of promises. The source of our UU understanding of covenant comes from the Hebrew scriptures, like that story of Noah. And in those Hebrew scriptures, God makes covenants again and again and again with God's people. We heard about just one of those. And the reason it has to happen again and again, the thing that I find compelling about covenants, as opposed to other promises, is that there's almost this assumption that covenants will be broken. They are a place to put our highest aspirations about how we want to be with one another and how we want to be out in the world. They're the place to make those really lofty promises, like planting a tree when you get married. And to know that there will be times when we do not live up to those ideals, when we fall short, and when we forget. But to also know that we can always come back. We can return again and again to those promises to remind ourselves of our aspirations and the way we want to be together. As Lisa Ward said in our Words for Reflection, a covenant leaves room for chance and change. It is humble toward evolution. It claims, I will abide with you in this common endeavor. Be present as best I can in our becoming. This calls for a level of trust, courage, and sacrifice that needs to be nurtured, renewed, and affirmed again on a regular basis. This covenant thing is a big part of what makes being part of a community like this one different from other communities we might be a part of in other parts of our lives. We commit to each other in a different kind of way, to showing up in the joyful moments and in the depths of grief. I love the way that Episcopal priest Liz Titchener describes it. She writes about the way her community showed up for her on the afternoon that she had to bury her child, to do the unimaginable, helping to fill in the grave with dirt. She writes, that might be the most awful thing I ever have to do. And yet, at the same time, all these people who I love so much came and chose to let their hearts break by doing this thing with me. They didn't have to show up. They chose to come and do that. And so I did it, with convulsions and sobbing in the earth, but then eventually they pulled me up and pulled me back and said, Liz, stop. Now everybody does that. Now we do this with you. Now we do this for you. And so I stood there, Liz said, and I watched as everyone else came and did this, put the earth in. And I thought, then, gosh, this is what it is. This is so much of why we come together, to make that choice of letting our hearts break with one another. This is who we are. When we gather as a Unitarian Universalist community, we are choosing to let our hearts break with one another, to rejoice with one another, to be one another's people. And we make that promise. And as with any covenant, any promise, sometimes we do that well, and sometimes not so much. Sometimes we nurture those promises, pouring in our time and energy, our compassion and care, and other times we forget, leaving the promises on the windowsill to wither and die. My first day in the office here as minister of this congregation back in 2015, I was given a plant. I know, you shouldn't have done that. It was a peace lily. And peace lilies are beautiful and they really are hardy. And so despite my proclivity to kill houseplants, I kept that peace lily alive for years. And not only did I keep it alive, it thrived. I, at one point, had to split it into 2 pots because it had grown so big. It was indeed hardy because I did not always remember to water it. There were definitely times as well when other members of the staff saw my lily drooping and gave it a little sustenance. And I love those peace lilies. And I also felt a responsibility to them. They became a symbol in some ways of my relationship with this congregation. And then the pandemic came. And I wasn't coming to the office anymore. So after that first week or so, when it became clear that this was going to be a more extended thing than just 2 weeks, I brought my peace lilies home. Now I have cats, and lilies aren't good for cats. So for a while, I did this juggling thing where I'd put them outside during the day and take them into the porch at night. And the first couple of months, I worked really hard to keep those peace lilies alive. But I'll admit that there was some point that I started to forget. Eventually, I don't know if it was too much water, not enough water, or too much sun, but they just shriveled up, all brown and sad. And I grieved for those lilies, for all that they represented. Or perhaps I grieved for all that the pandemic had taken from us. The normalcy and sense of safety we once knew, that sense of community that once felt so effortless. Today is nearly 2 years from the last time this sanctuary was full. The last time we gathered in the old way, when we still thought that this virus could be beaten with hand washing and elbow bumps. And I know for a fact that our sense of community has changed, has faded. Just like with my peace lilies, those first couple of months, we tried so hard to keep it alive, to live in to that line we say each week that we are connected even when we feel apart. And we showed up for each other in new ways with more energy than ever before. It is often this way in crisis moments, that burst of solidarity and togetherness, but it cannot last, and it does not last, and it did not last. 2 years in, it is harder to feel connected when we are apart. As this pandemic has dragged on, the fierceness of the flame of this community has dimmed. We've grown tired and complacent. We've drifted. We've forgotten to show up. We've forgotten those promises that once seemed so central. I know that I have felt less connected to you all as these months go by, less connected to the vibrancy of this community that I know is still there, hidden under that fear and complacency. There are even days that I worry that this community will go the way of my poor peace lilies, neglected and shriveled. But I do not think that will be our fate. The best thing about covenant is that actually it is even more resilient than the hardiest of plants. Our faith is all about those promises broken and remade, relationships waxing and waning, communities neglected and reignited. Covenant says we come back again and again and again, rebuilding trust just as God and the people had to rebuild trust again and again in those stories from the Hebrew Bible. It is never too late to remake the promises of our faith, to refuel our flame. This month, all month, we are talking about renewing faith, and it feels like an appropriate moment for that topic. Though we are not going to get that really satisfying moment of this pandemic being over and done that we have dreamed of, we are once again in a period of re-emerging, of coming back together out of that hard January we had. We are doing our best with what we have in this moment, greeting each other once again, or perhaps for the first time, rebuilding what was lost, reforming, I hope, this beloved community, remembering our promises and promising anew to be the ones who show up for each other in our joy and in our grief. This is how we live our faith and our purpose. The Unitarian theologian James Luther Adams wrote that human beings individually and collectively become more human by making commitment, by making promise. The human being as such, as Martin Buber says, is the promise making, promise keeping, promise breaking, and most importantly, promise renewing creature. We do not just make promises, we keep them, we break them, and when the time is right, we renew them once again. In this season, may we lean into the hope of being promise renewing creatures, renewing our faith and our commitments to one another. May it be so.